So we'll get started here in just a moment as others continue to log in. But while you're waiting, feel free to connect with us on social media using the QR codes on your screen. Just go ahead and give them a quick scan with your phone. My name is Stacy Padgington. I am the sales director here at Checkpoint EHR, and I will be today's host for the session. So we're excited to have you with us for what I know will be a thoughtful and timely conversation about one of the fastest evolving topics in behavioral health, how we can responsibly incorporate artificial intelligence into our work while preserving the professional judgment that providers rely on every day. So some housekeeping items before we jump in, just a few quick things. Everyone's muted, so that helps keep the session running smoothly. We'll have some time at the end for a dedicated Q&A session, so please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. Today's webinar is also being recorded, and everyone who is registered will receive a copy after today's session. So you'll notice the little Q&A box at the bottom that is highlighted in red. If you click on that during the presentation, you can ask your questions there, and then we'll get to them at the end. But again, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. And so I'm joined today by Katie Fournier, our Director of Customer Success and Operations here at Checkpoint EHR, who will be helping moderate throughout today's session. And you'll be hearing from today's guest presenter, Ashleigh Gardner-Cormier, founder of Aluma. We're excited to have Ashleigh joining us today to share her perspective on one of the most important conversations happening in behavioral health, how organizations can thoughtfully and ethically integrate AI into clinical practice while preserving the professional judgment that providers rely on every day. So before we jump into that, just a little bit about Checkpoint EHR. So I would just like to share, who we are and why conversations like this are so important to us at Checkpoint EHR. So for more than 20 years, we've partnered with behavioral health organizations to help simplify operations, improve workflows, and support long-term success, as some of you may already know. And at Checkpoint EHR, we believe EHR should be far more than just a documentation system. It should serve as the mission-critical infrastructure of your organization. So from clinical documentation and billing workflows to operational visibility, reporting, compliance support, and quality management, organizations depend on their EHR every single day to keep operations running effectively and efficiently. So as artificial intelligence continues to become more integrated into healthcare technology, we believe innovation should always strengthen, not replace, the expertise of the professionals delivering care. Our goal is to provide technology that helps organizations work more efficiently while ensuring providers remain at the center of every clinical decision, allowing them to spend more time focused on delivering exceptional care to the people that they serve. That's really important to us. So, and how we support you. So at Checkpoint EHR, we focus on helping organizations create consistency across clinical, operational, and financial workflows. And that includes documentation tools, billing automation, reporting, quality oversight, and thoughtfully designed AI capabilities that support providers, not replace them. So as AI continues to evolve, organizations are asking an important question. How can we leverage these new technologies while maintaining ethical standards, protecting professional judgment, and continuing to deliver the highest quality care? That's exactly why we're excited about today's conversation. It is an opportunity to step back and think not only about what AI can do, but how we should use it responsibly. So, with that, let's shift into today's focus. So ethical AI use in behavioral health, supporting provider judgment, not replacing it. Artificial intelligence is rapidly becoming part of everyday behavioral healthcare, from documentation assistance and administrative workflows to clinical decision support and operational efficiency. So as these technologies continue to advance, the conversation is no longer simply whether AI should be used in behavioral health. The more important question is, how do providers continue thinking like providers while using AI? That's the central question today's presentation explores. We're very excited to welcome today's presenter, Ashleigh Gardner Gardner-Cormier. Sorry, I keep messing up your name, Ashleigh.
That's fine.
Ashleigh is a licensed master social worker and the founder of Aluma, where she helps organizations explore the human side of AI-assisted work. Through practical frameworks, education, and reflective AI infrastructure, her work focuses on helping providers use AI responsibly while preserving the professional judgment that remains essential to ethical, high-quality care. So today, she'll introduce concepts such as judgment adaptation, ethical drift, constructive assumption error, unwarranted expansion, and what she calls ethical sufficiency, providing practical ways organizations can ensure AI remains a tool that supports clinical expertise rather than replacing it. Whether your organization is already using AI or just beginning to explore what's possible, I think you'll find today's discussion both thought-provoking and incredibly practical. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Ashleigh.
Thank you so much, Stacy.
Of course.
And hello, everybody. I'm excited to be here. As she said, I'm Ashleigh Gardner, LMSW, and founder of Aluma. And today we're going to talk about something that I don't think we're talking about enough. Or maybe it's just, it'll take us some time to get to the place where we're really discussing things on this level. And it's not whether or not AI should be used in behavioral health, because I think that ship has pretty much sailed. But what I want to talk about is what happens to us as practitioners when we use it. And what does it do to the way we reason and the way we review our own work and what we can do about it to make it safe. So this presentation is going to be really practical. I'm not here to scare you or tell you to stop using these tools. I don't think it would work anyway. But I'm here to give you a framework for using them better, right? So before I get into any content, I want to do a quick pulse check. And if we were in the room together, I would tell you to raise your hand, but since we're virtual, I'll just have you stop and think. I trust you to stop and think about these questions I'm going to ask. So the first one is, how many of you have used AI in some form in the last month, whether it was ChatGPT, a documentation tool, whatever? Now I want you to think about if you've used it to write or to organize clinical or professional information. And now I want you to be honest about this. Have you ever just accepted something that AI gave you because it looked right? You didn't necessarily dig into it. It just seemed plausible. And so you accepted it and you moved on. So that last one is what we're really going to zero in on today. But because it looked right, because it's not a clinical standard. And we all know that. But it's also a completely understandable human response, especially, when you're stretched thin and you're busy. Frequently we are in this line of work. But I don't think we've been honest enough with ourselves as a field about how often this is happening. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So we can go to the next slide. So again, yeah, we're going to talk about those moments where it looked right, and how we can address that within ourselves and get better. And we can go to the next one. Okay. So for a long time, the debate in behavioral health has been some version of, should AI be used at all? And there are people on both sides of that argument with real concerns, and they're valid. But I think that's the wrong question to be asking at this point. Or at least it's not the most useful one anymore, because AI it's in the room. It's already in the documentation tools. It's in the scheduling platforms. It's in the clinical decision support systems that your organization is probably already using. And so the question of whether we should be using it, it's been answered by adoption. And so the question I think we really need to be asking is, how do we continue thinking like providers while we're using it? And how do we stay in the driver's seat and make sure that what's going into a client's record or informing a clinical decision is actually reflecting our professional judgment and not just the most plausible thing that the AI produced. Okay, so we can go to the next one. Okay. So when most people talk about AI in clinical settings, they talk about efficiency. We want to save time, we want to get help with the documentation and just improve the workflow. We want things to go as smoothly and as quickly, as they can. And that's important. But what's harder to see, and this is what I think we're underselling, is that AI doesn't just change what we do, it changes the reasoning process around what we do. And it starts to participate in our decision making. And over time, if we're not careful, it starts participating in our professional judgment. And it's a different kind of impact than just saving time on a progress note. And I don't think our training or our ethics codes or even our organizational policies have really caught up to that yet. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so I know the title of this webinar talks about not replacing judgment, but I want to be clear that AI full-on replacing our judgment is not really the risk, in the sense that, we're professionals, and if we see a mistake or we see something that's obviously wrong, we're going to stop it, we're not going to continue with that because, it's our intent to be as ethical as we can possibly be. But the real issue is that AI changes the environment where our judgment happens. And the risk isn't that AI is making decisions for you, it's a lot more subtle. It's that the environment around your decision is shifting and really quietly and gradually and in ways that affect how you reason without you necessarily being aware of it. And that's actually harder to defend against than an obvious error. And with obvious errors, you catch it, environmental shifts, instead of catching it, you really adapt to them because that's what we do as humans. We may not even notice we've adapted to the environment, but it's what we do. So we can go to the next slide. And adaptation isn't new. We've done it before. We've been here before. You can think about GPS. Most of us don't navigate by landmarks or spatial memory anymore the way we used to. We don't need to anymore. And we adapt it because the tool is reliable, so we trust it. Spell check, it changed the way we proofread. Everybody's got Grammarly and everything else on their computers that we're using to just, make things go faster. And of course, EHR has changed the way we document and what we think of as a complete note, and clinical decision support tools. They've changed how some providers assess risk. And none of these adaptations were inherently bad. Most of them made life easier and our work more efficient, but they did change us. They changed the way we pay attention. They changed what we verify and what we offload to the system. And AI is the next step in that progression. And because it's more capable than any of the tools before it, and it can generate language and reasoning and clinical sounding conclusions, the adaptation is going to produce in us. The adaptation that it produces in us is more significant. And that's the thing we want to keep our eye on. So we can go to the next slide. Okay. So I've been using a phrase to describe this, and we're going to introduce a lot of new phrases throughout this training. If you'd like more details on that, I'll show you my website at the end. You can go and look at some white papers to kind of understand the reasoning behind that. But this particular phrase, I call it judgment adaptation, and it's a gradual adjustment of professional reasoning in response to increasingly capable decision support tools. And I want to be clear, again, this is a conceptual description that I'm using in this presentation, but I'm naming it because I think it's useful to have a name for something that's happening, but that we don't have a shared language around yet. And the question I want us to hold right now is, when does adaptation become over reliance? Because adaptation is not just a problem, it's human. We're supposed to adapt to our tools. But there's a point where adaptation starts affecting the quality of our professional reasoning in ways that matter for client safety. And I think we need to be more honest about where that line is. We can go to the next slide. Okay. And so here's what adaptation looks like over time. And I want you to notice just how reasonable each step sounds, right? On day one, we're checking everything. We're making sure everything is right because it's a new tool. We don't necessarily trust it yet, and we want to make sure it gets everything right. And so we're checking, we're verifying, we're skeptical. We get to week 2, and the tool, whatever it is, has proven itself to be pretty reliable. And so we skim it. We've used it a few times and it's working okay. And so we skim it a little bit. By month 3 is usually right. We have enough positive experience and feedback now that our default assumption about this particular tool is shifted, and we're trusting it more, we're verifying less. But by month 8, we trust it almost implicitly. It's not even a conscious decision at this point. It's just where we are. And if you notice, each step seems reasonable in the moment. None of it feels like a violation. And that's exactly what makes this hard. The change is gradual. It almost feels earned, like you're getting better at the tool. And so, we just trust it naturally. But what's actually happening is that your review process has quietly contracted. And this is what I call ethical drift. We'll get into that more, but you can go to the next slide. Okay. So what actually changed between day 1 and month 8? It wasn't the AI. The AI is doing the same thing it was always doing. It's generally plausible. The outputs, you feel like you can trust them because they're presented well. It was making assumptions on day 1, and it's still doing it by month 8, but, it looks good, so we trust it. But the tool just became familiar. The output's pretty predictable and our confidence goes up. And as our confidence goes up, our reflection gets quiet. And that's the arc of it. And I call this ethical drift. And the reason I think it matters so much is that it happens in the absence of any single bad decision. And you can drift significantly without ever making a mistake you'd recognize as a mistake. And we can go to the next slide. So what actually goes wrong when that review process contracts? I want to name 2 specific things because I think being concrete at this point is really important. When we're actively reflecting and we're genuinely reviewing AI outputs, we can catch errors, we can notice gaps, and we can push back on assumptions that AI is making. But when our reflection decreases, there are 2 particular kinds of errors that start slipping through at higher rates. And these are AI errors. The first I call constructive assumption error, and the second is unwarranted expansion. So we'll look at both of them because they sound abstract until you see the clinical examples, and then they get really real, really fast. So we can go to the next slide. Okay. For constructive assumption error, it's when AI generates a plausible conclusion based on information that was never actually provided. A way I like to explain this is with Alzheimer's. When people are, early in the stages of Alzheimer's, what they notice first is there are just gaps in their memory or with whatever they're able to come up with. And so if they're asked a question and there's a hole, they fill it with whatever makes sense. And we call this confabulation. It's something that happens all the time. And whatever they fill the hole in their memory with, it could be completely wrong, but it sounds good. And so they go with it. And this is a pretty consistent error that AI makes. And in this case, again, we'll call it constructive assumption error in the name of trying to develop a shared language around these things. Specifically in, there you go. Okay. Specifically in documentation, a provider might document that the client canceled 3 appointments. And that's a factual observation. There were just 3 cancellations, and that's what happened. But the AI might interpret this and produce the client appears resistant to treatment, maybe based on something else that was documented in the record. But it's not based in fact, it's not based on the input. And so you have to ask yourself, where did the resistance come from? It wasn't in the original note, and it's not a clinical inference the provider made in the input. So the AI filled the gap. And it did so with language that sounds clinical, and it sounds like a plausible assessment, but it's not what really happened. And so now that resistant to treatment notation is in this client's record, whether it's true or not. And so it could affect how future providers interpret this person. It could affect treatment planning, and everything moving forward for this particular client. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. Okay, the next is we want to talk about is unwarranted expansion. It's similar, but it's distinct. And this is where AI takes what's been provided and it extends it. It generates interpretations and conclusions that go beyond the available evidence. And one way that can help you remember this is when I think about unwarranted expansion, I think about my mother-in-law. I love her. She's a really sweet lady. But we all know that whenever my mother-in-law comes to town to visit, if the kids have a cough, if they have a headache, if anything's wrong, we tell them, tell us, don't say it in front of grandma, because Mima's going to say you need to go to the hospital, because if anything happens to you, you need to go to the hospital. It's an expansion beyond the data that's given. And all of my husband, all of his siblings know it, so all the grandkids know, you can't have any ailments. If you have to cough, hold it until Mima goes back home. And so, yeah, that's unwarranted expansion. Basically, in the clinical sense, the provider inputs, the client reports increased anxiety, and that's the data they entered. And the AI expands to include underlying trauma history, attachment disruption, avoidant coping patterns. And those could actually be clinically relevant things, and they might even be accurate for this particular client. But the real question that we have to ask ourselves is, what evidence supported those conclusions? Because if none of it was in the original input, then the AI extrapolated from a single data point to a comprehensive clinical picture, and that's problematic. But again, if the output sounds sophisticated and if it reads like a thorough formulation, there's a risk that it passes through review unchanged. And it's not because we're being careless, but it makes sense, and the environment has shifted, and it makes this kind of error easy to miss because we're not in the habit of being reflective and reviewing, because it's month 8 and we trust it, right? So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so here's the thing. I know none of what I'm saying is big news. Like, we all know that AI can make mistakes. It says at the bottom of ChatGPT and Claude that AI makes mistakes. So we know that happens. They hallucinate and fill gaps and extend beyond evidence. And that's discussed, and most providers who are using these tools, they're aware of it. But the question I want us to really sit with today is, can providers reliably recognize those mistakes after months of working with AI? Because awareness and reliability detection are 2 completely different things. You can know that something has a tendency to make mistakes, but it's easy to still miss those mistakes, especially if you're tired or rushing, or when the output just sounds right, and when your review process has gradually contracted over time. And in that gap between knowing AI can make a mistake and actually catching it is where the real risk is. So we can go to the next slide. Okay. So this is a turning point in the presentation today. We spent the first half really looking honestly at what's happening and how we can adapt and how drift occurs and the errors it produces. But now we want to talk about what we can do about it and where we need to draw the line as providers. And more importantly, how do we know where the line is and articulate to ourselves in the middle of a day, a busy clinic day, when we're looking at AI output and trying to decide whether we've reviewed it enough. So what I want to do is give you a framework, something you can actually use, and not just something that sounds good in a training. We can go to the next slide. Okay. So the concept I want to introduce to you today is it's called ethical sufficiency. And an ethical sufficiency is reached when enough professional judgment and reflective reasoning have been applied that the provider can confidently own the final decision as their own. And that doesn't mean that the AI produced something and I signed off on it, so I own this. Um, we want it to, or it's important that it actually reflects that the work that you've done and the output that AI has given you and the review that you've done ensures that it's work that you can actually stand behind. And it's not simply did the AI do a good job. We want you to still be able to use AI, and if the state comes in or whoever and reviews a record and asks you a question about it, even if it is an AI output, the review is important so that if a question is asked about it, you can stand behind it and say, yes, I said that, and have a reason for why. Because we don't want you to be in a position where you're like, I don't know where this came from, because maybe the AI committed constructive assumption error and filled in a hole, and you didn't know it. We can go to the next slide. Okay. So how do you actually apply ethical sufficiency in practice? So I want to give you 3 concrete checkpoints, and I call this the ethical sufficiency lens. And the reason I put it in 3 questions is so you can actually ask these questions to yourself easily while you're in the middle of working and not just in training. So the first checkpoint is, did AI assume? And you have to ask, is information being added that was never provided or verified? And this is a simplified version of constructive assumption error. And it's a way to just make sure that AI is not doing things that you didn't tell it to do. It also helps with our AI input, because if AI did have to fill a gap, it actually presents it to you that maybe your input needs to improve in some ways. The next checkpoint is, did AI extend, or are conclusions moving beyond what the available evidence actually supports? In other words, is my mother-in-law saying the kids need to go to the hospital because they coughed? Checkpoint 3 is, did I reflect? And this one is the most important. We have to ask ourselves, have we actively reviewed the reasoning, or did we just accept a plausible sounding output without really examining it? And these 3 questions, they won't catch everything, but what they do is create a pause point. And that pause point is where professional judgment can re-enter the process. We can move to the next slide. So I want to be direct about something here. Reflection isn't a soft skill. It's not a wellness practice or the part of the training that you just get through so you can do the real clinical stuff. It's the mechanism through which our judgment stays active. And it's the thing that keeps us in the loop when AI is increasingly capable of producing outputs that could bypass our review. And this is what I want you to understand about the stakes of this. As AI becomes more capable and the outputs become more sophisticated and more nuanced and clinically persuasive, reflection doesn't become less important. It becomes more important because the errors get harder to catch and the plausible sounding but possibly wrong output gets more plausible. So active reflection, it protects professional judgment, and our professional judgment is what protects our clients. We can go to the next slide. Okay. So I want to be honest with you. Just knowing that we should reflect is genuinely easy. I think everybody that's here today agrees with that. We learned it in grad school. It's in our ethics codes. We know, that it's important to do that. But I also recognize that the hard part is remembering to reflect while we're actually working, especially when the workload is really high and the tools become really familiar. So we get to the point where we feel like it's a natural extension of our own thinking. And especially when the output is right. And that's the gap that no amount of awareness training can close on its own, because when we're 15 notes behind and got 2 clients waiting, I'll reflect more carefully. It's not a system. At that point, it's really a wish because you just don't have time. And so that brings me to the thing I think is the most important. And we can go to the next slide. If reflection only exists in training, in policy documentation, or in our annual compliance requirements, then it disappears the moment the workflow gets busy. And the workflow in behavioral health is almost always busy. For reflection to actually function as a professional safeguard, it's got to be embedded. It has to live inside our workflows at the moment the decision is happening, not downstream of it or in a training room. And I think this is the design problem, if you will, that our field really has to take seriously. It's not enough to just tell providers to reflect, which that is an important part of it, but we also have to build systems and tools that make reflection possible at the point of use. Even if it's as simple as a stopgap that tells you to just stop and think. It could be as simple as a screen change to just jolt us back into the moment. So we're making sure that what we're doing is helpful or relevant to the care of our patients or clients. So just structured checkpoints, prompt-based reviews, and workflow designs that create these pause moments rather than assuming that providers will just self-interrupt under pressure. And this is a lot of what my work is built around at Aluma, and we can talk about that later. But we can move to the next slide. Okay, so I just want to bring this together with 5 principles I want to leave you with, and they're designed to be practical and to just hold up under the conditions you're actually working in, and not just in ideal scenarios. 1, AI can support judgment, and that's legitimate. It's the whole point, and but it's important that we use it as support and not just a substitute. And 2 is responsibility never transfers. So no matter how good the tool gets, our professional and ethical responsibility always stays with us. There's no version of the AI said so that functions as a clinical defense. You always have to be able to stand behind whatever you tell AI to produce, because at the end of the day, it's your name, your license that's on the line there. And 3, reflection becomes more important as AI becomes more capable and not less. So as the tools get better, the more deliberate we have to become about staying in the loop and standing behind the work that we do with AI. Four, verification protects our professional integrity, not just client safety, although that is important, but our integrity, our license, our record, and again, our ability to stand behind our work. And five, professional judgment has to remain active. It can't be in the background or dormant. It's got to be active, engaged, and present. And that's the whole thing. So we can go to the next slide. So it's just important to keep in mind that AI will continue to get better. We know that the tools will become more capable and the outputs will become even more convincing, more polished. So the integration into clinical workflow will become even more seamless. And that's coming regardless of what any of us decides in this webinar today. But the question is whether we become more intentional alongside it, whether we build our professional practices, whether they're individual or organizational, in a way that keeps human judgment genuinely at the center of this work. Not just as a formality or a checkbox, but as a real active and reflective presence. And that's what I believe is possible. And that's why I think conversations like this one matters today. So next slide. So questions, discussions, reflection, I know that'll come later. I'm just want you to know I'm open to that. And finally, the next slide. And that's it. So thank you. I really appreciate y'all's time today.
All right, thank you so much, Ashleigh. Yeah, so we are opening up the Q&A portion. So if you all have any questions for Ashleigh, feel free to post those in the Q&A section. Occasionally, some people can't find that Q&A section. So if you're only seeing the chat option, feel free to post your question in there as well. Yeah, but I do have a couple of questions here just to kind of get us started. So you described ethical drift as something that happens gradually. What are the earliest warning signs that a provider or an organization may be becoming overly reliant on AI?
Well, I would say, I don't know that it's necessarily a sign, but I would just say most specifically, if the AI policy wasn't built with the frontline workers in the room, it's a guarantee that things are going to drift. Just because, it used to be that we could make a policy and for the most part, everybody followed it because you never saw that there were any organizational issues that reflected that it wasn't followed. AI is the first time where the company is depending on the frontline workers to stay present, while they're doing their work, in order to survive, really, to prevent potentially catastrophic mistakes. So I would say the first sign is if the AI policies weren't written with the day-to-day work of the organization in mind.
Okay. How can supervisors or compliance teams evaluate whether providers are still actively applying that professional judgment and not just simply, approving whatever AI generated?
I think it starts with check-ins where people feel safe to communicate. I don't know how we can get to that place, but I think a really big issue is, I won't say failure to report, but people don't feel comfortable to really get into deep discussions about how they're using AI. And so it results in supervisors definitely not having that data as far as how reflective they're being. But I think safe spaces for communication and consistent reminders and a lot of times, just as in my own experience as a frontline worker, a lot of, they feel like the people above them don't really understand the pressure of the day to day. So I think openly expressing that you do, that you see them and asking for consistent feedback. I think that the conversation between administration, middle management, and frontline workers has to become a lot less guarded. The doors have to be open, so to speak, so that everybody feels, comfortable to communicate. Because with AI, with ethical drift, it's one of those things that accumulates over time. And by the time anyone at the top knows that problems have been happening at the bottom, there's a big issue within the organization. So I think communication is key.
Great. What training should organizations provide beyond just teaching staff how to use the AI tool?
I actually, Aluma has a training. It's a free training, as a matter of fact, that organizations can provide to their workers, that explains AI and helps them with how to be present, in their work. It's not I know we all have the modules that we complete when we start a job. We may read, we may not, we may listen, we may not, and we pass through them. But we've tried to make them as engaging as possible, but it speaks directly to the frontline worker. I don't know that there are any AI, like company AI trainings that speak directly to frontline workers, but I may be biased, but I think it's pretty helpful.
When reviewing AI, documentation, what types of language should providers watch for as signs of that constructive assumption or unwarranted expansion?
That's the thing. We know the habits of AI, the M dashes and the not this but that, those things, of course, but those are just typical AI behaviors. Constructive assumption error is something that we all have to individually be looking out for, because nobody can know, that mistake was made except the provider, because it looks right. And that's exactly the issue. To anyone who wasn't in the room with that client, there's no way for them to know that that's not what the client said, or that's not a plausible conclusion based on past behavior.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. What does enough of my own reasoning look like in practice? Like, is there like a simple test providers can use before, signing that AI documentation?
I would say it's not a test necessarily. It's a feeling. If it's a feeling of safety. If you give AI an input and it comes out with an output, you can read it and you can say to yourself, that sounds great, but can you say it's mine and feel comfortable with that? Can you know that if someone came in and reviewed all your notes on this particular patient, are you sure that if they ask you any question from what they've read, that you feel safe to answer it? That's the thing with AI. We're all using it. It's not something. It's different from the typical systems that we have, where we all use together, and it's a standard format. It's personalized. So we have to. It's our responsibility to really stop and reflect. I think about the code of ethics. I know specifically with social work, the code of ethics. Some parts of it, there's a written policy and a list of things that you have to do, but there's situations that we run into that there's no instructions for it. You have to ask yourself, does this I've met all the requirements on the list, but does this feel right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Let's see. So I'm not seeing any additional questions. But yeah, if folks want to know more, Ashleigh, where can they find you? Are you on LinkedIn, and then your website, obviously?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, Ashleigh Gardner-Cormier, and you can go to alumahub.net. The website's there on the screen for any additional information for white pages and for the training that I talked to you about.
Awesome, great. All right. Well, yeah, well, just as a reminder to everyone, the recording will be sent out after the presentation. But yeah, so thank you so much, Ashleigh, for joining us. We definitely appreciate it. Yeah, and we'll see everyone at the next webinar.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.